Now that we created a complete project and we tested it and know that everything runs correctly, it's time to deploy our DBT project. When I introduced DBT at the very beginning, I said it would help us with the different statements of the development workflow. A development workflow will look something like we've done so far. Developing, normally it would be in a separate branch. Testing and documenting those models. And all of this in a development environment like we've used so far, that it has its own separate schema, and it will be a separate user ideally. And after that, once all of this is ready, we are going to deploy it using version control and CI/CD as well in a production environment. So deployment at the end is the process of running these models that we created in our development environment in a production environment. Having this workflow, it's going to allow us to keep developing, to later deploy in the production environment, but without affecting the models that we already have running and testing in production. This deployment environment will run against a different schema. This will be using the production schema that I showed at the very beginning, which means that all of the models that we were creating before in dbt_Victoria, they're going to be created under production. So let's see how to run a DBT project in production. We saw in DBT Cloud that running the DBT model was simply running a command in the Cloud IDE. But DBT Cloud also includes a scheduler where we can create jobs and run them in production. These jobs are going to use the production environment, which means they're going to create those models in that production database. A single job can have multiple commands. So we saw that in the IDE, we were running always one command at a time. Here, we could actually separate them to have separate logs as well. Once we created our job, here we can see the creation of a job. Once we've created, we can trigger this manually, or we can actually schedule it to run it on their schedule basis. And this is how it's going to look like. The job is going to have every run that happened over time, and each run is going to have a log for the commands that we run in there. If the job is generating documentation, this can also be viewed under the details of the run. If one of the commands that we're running is dbt source freshness, in that case, the job will also have a link to the data sources, where it's going to show all of our data sources and the freshness. So here we can see that some of them, the data is fresh. There are others, they're close to the threshold that we had defined in the schema OML, and there are no stale branches. And lastly, a very important part of deployment is the continuous integration. Continuous integration is a normal practice in software development that establishes a regular immersion of those development branches into the central repository. And ideally, they would also include automated builds and test runs. The goal here is to reduce adding bugs to production code and maintain a more stable project. How can we do that with DBT? So we already know how to schedule jobs, and we know that in a job we can put as many commands as we want. We could enable to run those jobs from a webhook, from GitHub or GitLab, where we're hosting our repository. What is going to happen here is that once we open a PR, and this PR is ready to emerge, GitHub, it's going to send a webhook to DBT Cloud, and DBT Cloud will create a job that we've defined before, and it's going to start a run of this one. In this run, it's going to be using a temporary schema that has been created for the PR, and no PR will be able to be merged unless the run has been completed successfully. And here we can see how it would look like in GitHub. I am now going to show an alternative for those that are only using local development. Unfortunately, we can't use all of the benefits of DBT Cloud, and then we would have to use a different alternative. But if we go to our profiles.yml again, they remember that this was in the home and then .dbt and then a / profiles.yml. And here we have defined up to here, up to this part. We created a profile for using Postgres. We define our user, our password, and the database name, and a local development schema. We are now going to create a second target, which is called prod. And we're going to use a different user if we want to, and a different password. Here, since we are the only ones using this project, you could still use the same ones. And we are going to just change the schema. We could also use a different database name if you wanted to. And what it's going to do for us, it's going to allow us to run dbt build in this target, this dev target, or this prod target that we are going to indicate here in the command line. By default, it's going to take this target dev, which means that if I do dbt build, it's always going to run it against my dbt _ Victoria. But if I do dbt build -dev from target and I choose prod, we're going to see that it's going to run it against master, which is my schema for production. So what you could do is, now that you already know how to use a production target, so what you could do is check out into master and use it to deploy your models in production once you finish your development. Another thing that you could do to schedule those jobs is just simply use a cron and indicate the command, indicate the target as well.